So we're going to get started with our task for the afternoon. So to begin, I'm just going to share a reminder of what it is that we're doing this afternoon. And then I'm going to talk about briefly a recap of the process for creating recommendations, because our first breakout session this afternoon will involve a review of that process. So this is what we're doing. We're going to start with a review of the process, as I said, for developing recommendations, but also the need for a 7th weekend. So I mentioned at the start of today that, of course, we have 6 weekends booked in, but there's always been the option to have a weekend number 7. So we'll have an opportunity to reflect on that in our breakout groups. We will then, after that, begin the process of building the recommendations for question 3. So that's the same question you've been discussing this morning. And if you remember back to when we looked at travel, that is where we then start to look at that template and the actions that we want to be proposing. After that, we'll, I'm sure, have a well-deserved break before coming back to shift our focus then to looking at fairness. So we'll be reviewing and discussing those propositions on fairness, and overnight, so this won't happen in the session, it will happen overnight, you will then have the opportunity to vote on the propositions on fairness and also that option for an additional 7th weekend. So I'm just going to get started with a recap of what we heard last weekend on that process for developing recommendations. And please, as I'm going through, note any kind of comments or questions you have about what's here, because you'll have the opportunity to discuss that in your breakout groups next. So again, the question, as always, is how should Scotland change to tackle the climate emergency in an effective and fair way? That's our overarching question. And step 1 involves the development of the framework provisional recommendations to address our first question. So this is what we did last weekend in weekend 3. And between last weekend and this weekend, and then between this weekend and next weekend, what happens is a process of consolidation. So, of course, you can imagine across the 5 groups we have in this stream, you're coming up with loads of different recommendations. And if you recall when you did the feedback at the end of last weekend, we noted that some common ideas were coming out there. So what that process of consolidation does is it looks at what's coming out of each of your groups, and where there are proposals which are essentially the same, they are then brought together and consolidated. And you'll be able to see, because each of the things that you came up with has been given a unique number, you'll be able to see where those consolidated versions of text have been brought together from. So you'll be able to see that source. Where there were proposals that maybe looked a bit similar, but actually they were probably got some differences in there, it wasn't clear, they have and should have been kept as separate recommendations, because it will be up to you whether or not then you consolidate them or comment that they are exactly the same thing. There's also been what we call a technical refinement of proposed recommendations. But what that refinement really means is that we have invited some of our expert leads to look at that consolidated set of recommendations and to make some comments on them, which you'll be able to view tomorrow for the work stream when we come back to focus on that, which we hope and the experts hope will help you to do that process of refinement and think about whether or not the things you're suggesting are effective, think about where they need to be targeted, the levels of change and the power and things like that. So you'll see those comments come through tomorrow. And then this weekend, we are repeating that essentially, but we'll be focusing, of course, around questions 3 and 4 of our theme, which are related to the area of work. And then between this weekend and next weekend, you will, of course, receive a set of comments again from the evidence leads, but at this time around your recommendations for work. And you'll see that your recommendations have been consolidated in the same way. So again, comments around that, very welcome. Okay, so just a moment to review this slide, but essentially what it is just saying is what I've just said there. So that the proposed recommendations related to question 1 and 2 are going to be brought back this weekend. You'll have sight of them tomorrow after we've gone through that process of consolidation and technical refinement. So what you'll be doing tomorrow afternoon is you're going to be collectively reviewing and agreeing within your groups what you think should be put to the wider assembly for consideration, and we'll be noting that. When we're having that discussion tomorrow, there is an opportunity for you to identify any further information you think you need in order to make your recommendations when we get onto the next step of really, really honing in on what it is that you want to say and starting then on that process of refining text. And of course, bear in mind that what we're really trying to do is think about and look at how Scotland can change to tackle the climate emergency in an effective and fair way. So what I just want to pause and say about that is that doesn't mean that what we come out with at the end of today is the final product by any means. Of course, you may look at that set of consolidated recommendations and think, hey, there's a gap here, or there's something that wasn't said last weekend that absolutely should be, and I thought maybe another group have done it. So what this tomorrow afternoon will be about is really just collecting those kind of reactions, those thoughts, and making some comments so that when we come back next weekend, for the task which I'll tell you now, we'll really be able to pin down those recommendations that you want to make. So weekend 5, back together. We're going to repeat the process for the proposed recommendations developed in relation to questions 3 and 4. So what you do tomorrow afternoon will also be what you do at weekend 5, but for the work questions. And you're also going to start working in your groups to start developing what we call supporting statements for each recommendation. So what that does is it then builds on what you've already started to think about and starts to develop the text for why you believe your recommendations you're making are important, are fair and effective. So of course, from all the thinking you've done, we've already got the starters of some of that source material. But of course, there's quite a bit of work to do to really streamline that text, make it focused, and make sure that it communicates the recommendations that you want to communicate. Part of what you'll be reflecting on when we go into our breakout rooms in a short moment is also how you want to prioritize the set of recommendations you have, because you can imagine we have loads and loads and loads of different recommendations coming out of this process. So how do you want to process them? How do you want to present them? How many recommendations are we looking at here? And then moving on again to weekend 5, we will be presenting back your themes recommendations to the whole assembly for discussion and debate. So do remember that we'll be coming back together with the 2 other work streams. We'll be hearing what they've got up to, the stuff that's come out of there, and you'll be presenting back the same from this work stream. Then at weekend number 6, the whole assembly is going to review the full set of proposed recommendations to assess them for any contradictions, any gaps or wider opportunities. So there'll just be that final step there of refining the set of recommendations that you then want to put forward to vote on in order to endorse the recommendations for the final report and that key output from this assembly. Okay, so again, that was a bit of a repetitive presentation from what we heard last weekend, but I think it's really important to have done that before we then, of course, go into our discussions and reflections on that process itself. I just want to remind you that from the outset, there has always been this option to request an additional 7th weekend. Just to say that if you do vote for that 7th weekend, of course, that decision is entirely the Assembly's. What that will do in relation to what you've just seen there will allow us to basically slow down the process a little bit over weekend 5 and 6 to make sure that we're all completely satisfied that you feel that you're making the best recommendations that you can. And it will give us that time to maybe hear those bits of information that you think are absolutely integral to hear in order for you to make your recommendations, but also to refine that text and to make a really effective set of recommendations that communicates what it is that you want to communicate. And we really understand that some of you may be feeling a little bit rushed through this process. Of course, it always feels like there's never enough time, but you may want more time to consider the recommendations and potentially to get more information, as I said, on areas where you're developing your recommendations. So yeah, just to highlight, that is something that you will have the opportunity to make on a decision on later today. Okay, so that is it from me for just that recap there. And what we're going to do now is we're going to go into our breakout groups and we're going to have a brief review of the recommendation process. So we really want to be thinking here about whether you do understand the process and you have any questions about it. If you want to have a discussion about whether or not you think we need that additional weekend. But we also want you to think about how we should be prioritizing or refining that number or the nature of the recommendations that are coming through as well. Bearing in mind that I'm sure you want to produce a report that is really effective and really communicates and pinpoints where you think the most effective change and fair change is needed. Okay, right, I think we are ready to go into our breakout groups. So if we could open them up, and I'll see you back here in a short while. Okay, that looks like everyone's back. Right, well, welcome back. Hope you had a good break and some excellent discussions just there. So as I said, we're now moving on to a review of the propositions on fairness. And again, we're doing this, and it's important that we do this as it's a key part of the question that we're asking the Assembly. So I'm going to just start with a couple of reminders, and then I'm going to share some slides and run through the propositions of fairness that have come out and that we'll be discussing when we move into our breakouts. So just to remind you that in weekend 2, you heard from Kevin Anderson and a presentation put together by Professor Tahsin Jaffrey, another member of the evidence group, which both explored different aspects of what fairness might mean in the context of responding to the climate emergency. Then following this, you worked in your groups to respond to the question, which was as follows. To be fair, the recommendations that we as an Assembly present to a Parliament should... ... So overall, when looking at that, you created over 150 statements actually, which have then gone through that process by the facilitation team of being grouped together where there are similar themes or the same themes, to now bring back 22 consolidated propositions on fairness. Now, I'm going to, as I said, show you the screen with those propositions, but I think there's a few things to bear in mind. So there may, for example, when you see them, be perhaps some tensions or some contradictions that you identify between them. But each of them that you see here has been presented by at least some of the members of the Assembly as an important aspect of considering fairness when making recommendations for change. So although you may see those tensions and contradictions, that's because they've come up from you, from the Assembly members across the Assembly. After you've had some time to discuss and reflect on them, which you'll be doing after I present them in a moment, we will be asking each of you individually to identify the 10 that seem the most important for the Assembly to be considering when you then go through the process of developing and evaluating the potential recommendations that you're going to make. So you'll be seeing those 22 in a moment, but what you'll be doing when you do that vote overnight is identifying the 10 that you think are the most important for you. And that will give us something that will then kind of form the basis for when we do that review of fairness later. So none of them, of course, are going to be lost unless no one in the Assembly identifies anything within their top 10. But it will give us all a sense of which are the most important to the majority of members. And that is essentially going to then create the list for you as an Assembly to keep returning to when we're considering and prioritising the recommendations that we'll make in our report to the Parliament. Okay, so hopefully that is clear. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to share my screen, and I am going to go through what those propositions are. And remember, as I said, just kind of listen to them, think about what you want to have a discussion with your group about. If there's anything kind of you need to make sense of, maybe look for some of those tensions and those contradictions. And of course, you'll have a chance to talk about those in a moment. Okay, so I said, key question, how should Scotland change tackle the climate emergency in an effective and fair way? Our propositions on fairness, so they'll begin with the following statement and we'll flow from this. And that opening statement is, to be fair, the recommendations that we as an Assembly present to the Parliament should... ... And this is what you said. They are in no particular order. We've just jumbled them up. So please don't read any of the numbers or anything as some kind of preference. It's absolutely not that. We've just jumbled them up and given them a number so that when you have your discussions, it's an easy thing to reference as an easy reference point. Okay, so number 1, spread resources and the costs of change equitably rather than equally, so that those who can afford the most pay the most. Number 2, Support people to grow knowledge and understanding, to make informed decisions, and help those with the least capacity to make change to play their part. Number 3, not disadvantage rural communities. Number 4, consider Scotland's impact and global share of carbon emissions historically and for embodied carbon. Number 5, be free from self-interest and non-partisan. Number 6, support high carbon industries through the transition. Number 7, take into account the needs of different communities across Scotland, recognising that there is not a one-size-fits-all solution. Number 8, support workers in industries where change will lead to job losses. Number 9, not disadvantage people with disabilities. Number 10, act immediately so that future generations are not unfairly burdened with the responsibility of making change. Number 11, not have a negative impact on developing countries. Number 12, prioritise measures and investments that benefit everyone for the common good. Number 13, emphasise that it is everyone's responsibility to make changes, individuals, communities, business and government. Number 14, put the people of Scotland first. Number 15, involve ongoing engagement with the people most affected by change. Number 16, not ask too much change from people too quickly. Number 17, not increase social and economic inequalities. Number 18, protect vulnerable and disadvantaged groups from impacts of climate change and measures to combat it, ensuring no one gets left behind. Number 19, target the highest emitters so that organisations and individuals with the highest carbon footprint have to make the biggest changes. Number 20, be affordable to all and not disadvantage people on lower incomes. Number 21, be cost effective and consider implications for the public purse. And number 22, ensure that businesses and industries that have benefited most in the past contribute the most. Okay, so that brings us to the end of those consolidated 22 statements there. So as I said, you are now going to go into your breakout groups and you're going to have a discussion around those propositions to explore a few different things and to prepare for your individual vote later on today. So things that we want you to think about are, do any of those propositions seem really particularly important to you, and why or why not? Was there anything in there that surprised you? And are there any tensions or contradictions between them that you may have noticed and might want to air and discuss? Okay, so we're going to open our breakout rooms now. Your facilitators have a copy of those propositions, of course, if you want to go back and look at them and refer to any of them. But we'll let you go to your breakout rooms now to discuss. And I'll see you back here. After that, we'll be coming back and just wrapping up, and I'll be telling you a little bit more about how the vote's going to work. Brilliant, that's all of us. Welcome back, everyone. I hope you enjoyed the discussions there around fairness and they helped crystallize or clarify any questions that you had and think about how you might want to vote later. So I just wanted to quickly talk to you about the voting process, of course, so you know what's going on. Some of those of you that keep a keen eye on your inbox might notice that an email has landed which has an attachment that has all of the propositions on it. So you should have a document within that email, which basically is the same as the slides I showed you earlier, as well as a link to a voting form. So that voting form is going to have 2 questions for you to complete. The first question will be your chance to identify the 10 propositions on fairness that are most important to you. So from that list of 22 that we've been through, you'll be identifying the 10 that are most important to you. So that's to you as an individual member. The second thing is voting on whether there should be an additional assembly weekend. So that will be weekend number 7. So just to explain some details related to weekend number 7 that's really important to know before we go into that and you make your decision. So first of all, weekend number 7 would take place on the following dates, the 20th and 21st of March. And we can decide close to the date whether we need the whole weekend or not. And I mentioned that as I've reviewed some of the comments that came out of your previous discussion. So hopefully that helps to clarify some of the questions you had about dates. So 20th and 21st of March, and we can decide close to the date if we need the whole weekend or maybe a shorter chunk of time. So that is taking place then 2 weeks after the last currently scheduled meeting. So it'll be an extra 2 weeks, that last 2 week. So something about thresholds, it's really important. So of course, when you vote, you need to know how many people are in agreement for that thing to be carried, for that thing to be put into action. So if 75% of members agree that an additional weekend is required, then we will go ahead of it. So it's really important to know that we need 75% of members to agree. And of course, we can adjust the current plans for developing recommendations to make best use of that extra time that we'll have. So if you remember earlier, I said, if we did get a 7th weekend, we can work at a slightly slower pace, although we would go through the same process, but it's just a case of different pacing. So if the decision is made to hold an extra weekend, members will receive the same thank you gift as any other weekend as a recognition of your contribution. I think that's really important to know too. So just to clarify, you should expect to receive the same thank you gift as you get for every other weekend if you participate in weekend 7 too. Okay, so what do you need to do? So we need you to take a look at that email, to click the link, go through to the voting form and complete it. We need you to complete that before the meeting starts tomorrow morning. So by 10 a.m. tomorrow morning, you should have gone onto that form and completed it. So you can do that overnight. You could do it in the morning. You may want to spend a bit more time reflecting what it is that you want to vote, and that's absolutely fine. But please do it before we meet at 10 a.m. tomorrow morning. It's really, really important that everyone is involved in these decisions. So if you have absolutely any difficulty accessing the form, please let the support team know as soon as possible, and they will contact you to make sure that your vote is counted and support you so that you are able to vote. So please let us know if you've got any trouble at all. We want to hear all of your opinions so we can make that happen. That just leaves me then with a reminder that it will be a 10 a.m. start tomorrow. Please do join the waiting room a little bit early as usual to avoid any last minute technical hitches, and give the support team a shout if there's anything that you need a bit of help with in the morning. And that just leaves me really to give you a massive thanks for all your participation today. I know it was a lot of thinking, a lot of listening, and a lot of discussing again. But hopefully you enjoyed it and you've learned a lot and been able to share what it is that you want to share. And of course, when we come back tomorrow, we'll then be moving on to looking at the final question within this work stream, question number 4. And we'll also in the afternoon be going back to look at what came out of last week's discussions on travel. Okay, well, thank you so much, everyone. Also, thank you to all the contributors this weekend too. I know Catherine is still with us on the call. I hope you have a restful evening. Please do complete your voting form. Let us know if you've got any issues, and we look forward to seeing you at 10 a.m. sharp tomorrow morning.